Jake Carter limped down the concrete corridor of the Rocky Mountain Animal Shelter, the sharp sound of his prosthetic leg tapping against the floor echoing through the empty hallway. It had been over a year since the explosion that had stolen his leg, but the phantom ache still lingered, the kind of pain that wasn't real, yet felt more real than anything else. His fingers brushed against the cool, rough surface of the walls as he moved, the fluorescent lights buzzing above him like a swarm of angry hornets. The sharp, metallic scent of cleaning supplies mixed with something else, something wet and desperate. He could feel it in the air. The sense of abandonment. Animals were just like people sometimes, broken, lost, and waiting for a second chance. Last cage on the right, Kevin, the shelter attendant, called out from behind him. Fair warning, he's been returned 3 times. Jake paused. 3 times. His hand instinctively clenched into a fist, the metal of his prosthetic glinting under the harsh light. He didn't need to ask why. Dogs, like soldiers, didn't forget their trauma. They lived with it in their bones. Maybe they always would. He turned the corner, the cage appearing at the end of the hall. The last one, the worst one, it seemed. Behind the bars stood the largest German shepherd Jake had ever seen. The dog's fur was thick, yet matted in places, and his eyes were distant, cloudy, as if the world had faded away from him. One ear stood erect, but the other hung at an odd angle, torn at the base. A jagged scar stretched from his left eye down to his snout, where a black nose twitched in the dim light. Jake took a step closer. The dog didn't move. His eyes followed Jake's every motion, but there was no aggression, just weariness. "What's his story?" Jake asked, kneeling slowly so he wouldn't seem threatening. He knew what it was like to feel hunted, even when there was no real threat. Kevin's voice dropped lower. Military K-9, handler, died in combat. Failed all his retraining after that. They say he's broken. He swallowed, a nervous look crossing his face. "That dog? He's not the same. They brought him back twice already. Said he's dangerous." Jake's chest tightened, the familiar sensation of old wounds reopening. "I'll take him." The words came out before he could stop them. But the truth was, he didn't need to think twice. The dog was like him. Maybe not in body, but in spirit. Broken, scarred, waiting. Kevin eyed him warily. "You sure? It's not just a charity case, man. He's got issues." Jake looked at the dog again, who stood motionless, but there was a flicker in those cloudy eyes, a spark of recognition maybe, a flicker of understanding. Jake's hand trembled as he reached toward the bars. The dog's massive head dipped forward, and he pressed his muzzle into Jake's palm. "Yeah," Jake whispered, barely audible. "I'll take him." The wind outside howled, cutting through the silence of the cabin like a ghost from another time. Snow fell in thick, steady sheets, accumulating against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, casting soft shadows across the walls of the small mountain cabin that had become Jake's sanctuary. Jake sat in the worn armchair by the hearth. A thick blanket draped over his legs. The prosthetic felt heavier than usual tonight, its cold metal pressing against his skin, reminding him of everything he had lost. Ghost, as if sensing his discomfort, lay on the floor beside him, unmoving but always alert. The dog's eyes were fixed on the fire. But Jake knew the look, distant, haunted. He didn't need to ask what Ghost was thinking. He knew the dog saw flames in the darkness too. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the nightmares came. The familiar tremor ran through Jake's body as his eyes shot open. The cabin was dark, save for the faint glow of the dying fire. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding as if it might burst through his chest. Sand, gunfire, screams. He could feel the heat of the explosion, the deafening roar of metal and death. "Not again," Jake whispered to himself, his hands trembling as he sat up in the bed, eyes wild. But even as his mind screamed for him to wake up, to escape, there was a sound. Jake turned his head just in time to see Ghost settle beside the bed, his cold nose pressing against Jake's arm. The dog's eyes met his with an intensity that startled him. For a moment, Jake forgot about the terror clawing at his insides. Instead, all he could focus on was the calm, steady rhythm of Ghost's breathing. Ghost exhaled sharply, a sound that felt almost like a sigh, and then nudged his head into Jake's lap. There was no growl, no whine, just the comforting presence of a creature who, like him, had known too much of the darkness. Jake didn't even know when he had stopped trembling, but as his hand instinctively reached down to stroke Ghost's thick fur, he realized the nightmare had faded. The familiar thrum of panic in his chest had slowed. Ghost didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to bark, to nudge, or even to lick. He simply stayed close, silent, and still. "You see them too," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the cabin. Ghost shifted slightly, pressing his weight against Jake's leg, as if in agreement, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that would last forever, but it was enough to let him breathe again. The bell above the door jingled as Jake stepped into the Last Chance diner, his boots scraping against the worn tile floor. The warmth of the diner hit him immediately, a sharp contrast to the icy coldness that had followed him from the cabin. The scent of grease, coffee, and something sweet mixed in the air as he made his way to the counter. Behind the counter, 16-year-old Emily was busy refilling coffee mugs, her hands quick and sure, despite the fact that she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were dark, too dark for someone so young, but there was a quiet resilience in them, something that Jake had come to recognize all too well. "Morning, listener," Emily said, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter to Jake. She didn't look at him directly. Instead, her eyes remained focused on the sketchbook propped up on the counter in front of her. "Ghost got your coffee first," she added with a teasing smile. Jake chuckled softly as he reached over to scratch Ghost behind the ears. The dog, as always, was sitting at his feet, watchful and still. "He always gets what he wants," Jake said, glancing down at Ghost, who gave a soft huff, as if in agreement. Emily giggled, her fingers flipping through the pages of her sketchbook. Each page was filled with intricate drawings of Ghost, his sharp eyes, his scars, his quiet watchfulness. She had been drawing him like this for weeks, ever since he'd started accompanying Jake into town. "He waits for people to break," Emily said, her voice thoughtful, almost melancholic, as she traced a line on the page. "Like he knows when they're about to fall apart. I think he understands them, like he understands you." Jake's heart skipped a beat, but before he could respond, the door slammed open with a force that rattled the diner's old frame. The sudden gust of cold air sent a shiver through him, and Jake instinctively tensed, his hand reaching toward the comforting weight of the gun holstered under his jacket. "Time to go, girl," Roy growled, his voice thick with whiskey. The man staggered into the diner, his shirt untucked and his breath reeking of stale alcohol. His eyes were bloodshot, and his movements were sluggish, like a man who had been up far too long. "Roy," Emily's voice was quiet, but it was laced with a tremor. She didn't look up from her sketchbook, but Jake could feel the tension radiating from her. "You're not leaving," Roy barked, taking a step toward Emily. His fist clenched at his side, and Jake's hand tightened around the edge of the counter. Ghost's head snapped up at the sound of Roy's voice. His body tensed, muscles coiling in anticipation. He didn't need to be told what to do. Without hesitation, Ghost stood and moved between Emily and Roy, his teeth bared, his growl low and menacing. The sound was enough to make the air crackle with electricity. Roy stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing at the dog. "What the hell's this mutt gonna do? Bite me?" he sneered. Jake didn't move, but his voice was steady, low. "Back off, Roy." Roy scoffed, taking another step forward. "Or what? You'll let this dog tear me apart?" Emily's hands trembled as she slid off her stool, but before she could step between them, Jake stood up, his eyes never leaving Roy's. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to signal that things were about to get ugly. Ghost's growl grew deeper, the warning clear. "Take it outside," Jake said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Leave her alone." The wind outside had picked up, howling through the cracks in the diner's old windows as the storm raged on. Jake's hand was still wrapped tightly around the counter, the familiar ache in his shoulder reminding him of too many battles, of fights he couldn't always win. Roy's presence in the room like a shadow pressed down on the air, but Jake wouldn't let him control it. Ghost's growl was low, but it carried an unspoken promise. If Roy came any closer, he wouldn't just bite. He would tear. The dog's muscles were tense, ready to move, and Jake knew without a doubt that Ghost would protect Emily, protect him without hesitation. Roy took another step forward, oblivious to the danger. "You think that damn mutt can stop me?" he sneered, the stench of whiskey heavy in the air. He was too far gone, too angry to see reason, too drunk to care about the consequences. Jake's instincts kicked in, and before he could say anything more, Roy swung, his fist connecting with Emily's arm. It wasn't a strong punch, but it was enough to make her stumble back. Everything went still for a moment. The air hung thick with tension, thick enough to choke on. Then, Ghost was in motion. The German shepherd lunged forward, intercepting Roy's swing with his shoulder, the crack of impact like a shot in the quiet diner. The blow sent Roy stumbling backward, the force of it knocking him off balance. For a moment, he floundered, reaching out to grab anything, anything to steady himself. But Ghost was relentless. The dog didn't snap or bite, but his body had absorbed the force of Roy's aggression, and now he was standing firm, a living barrier between the two humans. Jake didn't wait. His combat reflexes took over, the movements honed by years of training, by surviving when every moment was a fight. He stepped forward, grabbing Roy by the shoulders and knocking him flat onto the greasy diner floor with a single shove. "Get out," Jake growled, his voice low and steady, but full of enough anger to burn through the storm outside. "Take your drunken ass outside before I help you out the door." Roy lay there for a moment, stunned, and then slowly, grumbling under his breath, he climbed to his feet. His eyes locked on Jake, his face twisted with fury, but he didn't move to fight. He was too broken for that. "You'll regret this," Roy muttered, his words thick with rage. But when he staggered toward the door, Ghost didn't move, didn't let him pass. "You know how to take a hint, Roy," Jake said, his voice cold as he watched the man retreat. "Next time it's not just Ghost you'll have to deal with." Roy muttered something unintelligible, but he finally left, slamming the door behind him with a sound that reverberated in the quiet room. The diner was still, except for the slow, steady breathing of Jake and the dog at his feet. Emily remained by the counter, her hand pressed to her arm where Roy had struck her. She didn't look up, but Jake could see the tremor in her shoulders. It wasn't from the cold. "Emily?" Jake started, but his voice faltered. He didn't know how to help her, how to fix the things Roy had done to her, how to fix the things that both of them had endured. But Ghost seemed to know. The dog, who had been a silent sentinel throughout it all, padded over to Emily and sat down beside her. His large head nudged her hand gently, his muzzle warm against her fingers. Emily looked down at him, and for a moment there was a flicker of something. Her lips trembled, the tears she had been holding back for so long threatening to break free. She didn't speak, but the look she gave Jake said everything. "Thank you." Jake wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. He had never been good at this, at comforting people, at being the protector when his own life was such a mess. But Ghost was good at it. The dog understood, in a way that no one else did. "Come on," Jake said quietly, his voice softer now. "Let's get you home." But as they walked out into the storm, Jake didn't feel the coldness of the wind or the weight of the night. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, with Ghost, with Emily, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The days after the diner incident were a blur. Emily's arm had bruised quickly, but it was the emotional toll that cut deeper than any physical injury. Despite the reassurance from Jake and the ranch's steady rhythm, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, as if the storm that had passed through the diner was still swirling inside her. Jake had expected a confrontation from Roy. He didn't know when it would come, but he knew it was inevitable. What he didn't anticipate was the way Roy's accusations would twist the truth into something unrecognizable. It was the morning after Roy had left the diner that the first knock on their door came. Jake opened it to find a uniformed officer standing on the porch, a clipboard in hand. "Are you Jake Carter?" the officer asked, his tone neutral, but with an underlying gravity. "I am," Jake replied, frowning. "What's this about?" The officer hesitated, as if the next words weighed more than he wanted to admit. "There's been a report. We need to discuss an incident involving your dog. Ghost Roy Elkins, the individual who you had an altercation with in the diner, has filed a formal complaint. He's claiming that your dog attacked him." Jake's heart sank. He had expected trouble, but this was a different kind of trouble. A threat that could tear apart everything they had fought for. "Ghost didn't attack anyone," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. He glanced over his shoulder at Ghost, who was lying by the door, watching with those ever-knowing eyes. "I understand, but Roy claims that the dog was aggressive and that you were unable to control it," the officer continued. "We'll need to take a statement from you." Jake glanced at Emily, who had stepped out of the cabin at the sound of their voices. She stood there silently, her face pale, but her eyes hard, fighting back the emotions that threatened to rise to the surface. "It wasn't like that," Jake repeated, his voice low and firm. "We need to talk to the lawyer. I'm not letting anyone take Ghost from us." The officer nodded, jotted something down on his clipboard, and turned to leave. "We'll be in touch." As the officer drove away, Jake turned to Emily. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" Emily nodded, but her gaze was distant, her arms wrapped tightly around her. "I know. But Ghost didn't do anything wrong. He was protecting us." They spent the next few days trying to make sense of the situation, talking to their lawyer, and trying to prepare for what was coming. It wasn't just a legal fight. It was a battle for Ghost's life, for the life they had built together, for the future of the ranch. The situation was escalating. With Roy's accusations painting Ghost as a dangerous animal, the community was starting to turn. Some were sympathetic to the veteran and the dog who had saved him, but others had begun to whisper, casting doubts on whether the German Shepherd was truly as safe as everyone had claimed. The ranch's reputation hung by a thread. Emily spent hours sketching, trying to distract herself from the growing anxiety, but it didn't work. A week later, they received a notice. It was official. Ghost's fate would be decided in a courtroom. Jake stared at the letter, his knuckles white around the paper. "This is it," he muttered. "If we don't win this." Emily's voice was quiet, but determined. "We will win. We have to." The day of the hearing arrived sooner than they expected. Jake stood outside the courthouse, the familiar feeling of dread creeping into his chest as the cold wind bit at his face. He had been through wars, through firefights, but nothing compared to the uncertainty he felt now, standing before a judge who held the power to take Ghost away, take away everything they had fought for. Emily was beside him, her usual confidence replaced with a tight-lipped determination. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, glancing at the dog standing loyally at their side. Ghost's presence was a calming force, but even he seemed to understand the weight of the day. He sat quietly, his head held high, waiting for whatever came next. Jake nodded, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just about a dog. It was about his own redemption, about proving that the bonds they had built weren't just survivable. They were vital. They were real. "We're in this together," Jake said, his voice low but unwavering. "And we're not walking away without a fight." The courtroom was sterile, cold, and too bright. The scent of lemon polish mingled with the faint hum of air conditioning, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a hospital waiting room than a place of justice. Jake stood near the back, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the proceedings. He hadn't wanted to be here. In fact, he would have rather stayed in the woods with Ghost at his side, living a quiet, solitary life. But Emily had asked him to come. And so he did. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man with slicked-back hair, clicked through a series of photos, each one showing Ghost's teeth bared in a snarl. Each photo made the dog appear more dangerous, more unpredictable. The prosecutor's voice was sharp as he spoke. "This animal is dangerous," he declared, his words like poison turning the room's eyes toward Ghost. "He's unfit to live in a civilized society. He's a liability, a threat, and the community will not be safe as long as he's allowed to roam free." The judge, a weary-looking man in his mid-60s, leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together. He had heard this kind of argument before. He knew the drill, and for a moment it seemed like Ghost's fate was already sealed. But then something unexpected happened. Emily stood up. Jake didn't know what she was doing at first. She had barely spoken a word since the diner. But now her hands were trembling as she reached for the edge of the table. Her eyes were locked on the judge, her face pale. And then she triggered it, her panic attack. Jake's heart sank as Emily's breath grew shallow, her hands clutching at her chest. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in like a vice. Her body was shaking now, her knees buckling as she struggled to stay upright. The moment was chaotic, but Jake wasn't the only one who noticed. Ghost's head snapped up, and without a second thought, the dog pushed his way through the crowd of onlookers and rushed toward Emily. His movements were swift, his body slicing through the tension with precision. Ghost reached her side in seconds, pressing his forehead gently to her chest. His breath was steady, rhythmic, and Emily's frantic breathing began to slow as she felt the comforting warmth of his presence. The panic attack started to subside as she leaned into him, her hands brushing through his fur. The entire courtroom fell silent, the shift in the atmosphere undeniable. The judge, who had been watching with an intensity that bordered on disbelief, removed his glasses and set them on the desk. He stared at Ghost, his face softening just slightly. The prosecutor, too, seemed stunned. His earlier confidence had melted away in the face of this raw, unspoken truth. After what felt like an eternity, the judge cleared his throat, his voice soft but firm. "Case dismissed." Jake didn't know how to feel. There was a moment of silence as the room processed the judge's ruling. But for Jake, there was only one thing that mattered. Ghost had won. Not with violence, not with aggression, but with a quiet strength that spoke louder than any argument. And Emily? She was safe. A year had passed since the courtroom, and the small farmhouse, nestled at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, looked different now, alive with purpose. The sign outside swung gently in the breeze, creaking in the wind. Second Chance Ranch. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. Jake stood at the edge of the land, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. He watched the sunrise, the light spreading slowly over the snow-capped peaks in the distance, painting the world in shades of gold. The fresh mountain air filled his lungs, clean and crisp, a far cry from the stifling air of the city or the damp smell of hospital rooms. Ghost padded silently beside him, his movements graceful, every step in tune with Jake's. The dog's once somber eyes had brightened with time, the cold distance gone as his trust in Jake deepened. They had both healed, in their own way. But healing was never a clean process. The scars didn't fade completely. They never did. They just became part of the story. "You good?" Jake asked, glancing down at the German shepherd, who looked up at him with a steady gaze. His ears perked, his body strong and sure. Ghost barked twice in response, a sound that was more joyful than Jake had ever heard from him. And for once, the bark didn't feel like a warning. It felt like an invitation. Jake smiled, his face softening as he ruffled Ghost's fur. "Happy gotcha day, old boy." Behind them, a familiar voice called out, and Emily appeared from the barn, carrying a bucket of feed for the horses. Her hair was a little longer now, her shoulders broader. The girl who had once been so fragile now standing tall and strong, The time she spent at the ranch had shaped her, just as it had shaped the dogs they rescued and the veterans who trained them. It was a community that didn't just heal the animals, but the people too. "Happy anniversary to you too," Emily called out, grinning as she approached. She set the bucket down, then turned to look at the ranch behind them, at the land that had come to symbolize so much more than just a place. It was their home, their sanctuary. "You know, Ghost's bark's getting louder," Jake remarked with a chuckle. Emily laughed, the sound rich and full of warmth. "I think he's starting to like it here. Maybe even love it." Jake nodded, his gaze turning to the rest of the ranch, where veterans and rescued dogs worked side by side, training together. There was Dr. Chen, the ranch's veterinarian, tending to the dogs, her son Jamie beside her, his face lit with joy as he held his dog's leash. The ranch had grown into something bigger than just a second chance. It had become a lifeline, not just for animals but for everyone who walked through its doors. A place where healing wasn't just a concept, but a daily practice. Jake tossed a steak to Ghost, who caught it mid-air with practiced precision. "I'd say this has turned into a pretty good day." Ghost tilted his head, his eyes twinkling with something almost mischievous before he let out a low bark, followed by a loud, excited woof that echoed across the fields. The sound was so full of life that it took Jake by surprise. The dog had come a long way from the broken creature who had once sat in a cage, waiting to be cast aside again. As if on cue, the other dogs in the yard began barking, joining in the chorus as they ran around the training area, tails wagging. It was like a symphony, one that Jake had never expected to find in the quiet of the mountains. Emily crouched down beside Ghost, offering him a treat. "You're something else, aren't you, big guy?" she murmured, rubbing behind his ears. Jake smiled, watching the interaction. The girl with the sketchbook and the dog who had saved them both had found a home here, just as he had. He didn't need to say it aloud. He didn't need to speak the words that he had buried deep in his chest. They all knew it, in their own ways. The ranch was more than just a place. It was a story being written by everyone who was willing to heal. And with every passing day, that story was becoming more beautiful than he had ever thought possible. "You know," Jake said, as he watched Emily, "I never thought I'd be here. I didn't even know if I could be fixed." His voice was quiet, almost reflective. Emily looked up at him, her expression softening. "I think you were always meant to be here. You just had to find your way." Jake nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, meaningful moment. "Maybe you're right." He felt a weight in his chest, but it wasn't the burden of his past anymore. It was something else. Something lighter, a promise, a future. The German shepherd stood up from his place at Emily's feet, then barked twice, louder this time, more confidently, before running off toward the training area, his tail wagging in the air. Emily stood and followed, calling out to the other dogs as they joined in the chase. Jake watched them for a long moment before turning back to the horizon. The sky was clear. The snow had begun to melt in patches, and the world seemed to be waking up from its long winter slumber. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was waking up too. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land, Jake stood beside Ghost, watching the last of the light slip beneath the horizon. They had found their place in the world. Together, a place where the scars didn't have to define them. They were no longer the broken ones. They were the ones who had written their own endings. If you enjoyed Jake, Ghost, and Emily's journey of second chances and healing, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts with us. What part of their story resonated with you the most? And if you want more stories like this, hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring these powerful tales to life, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as we continue to tell more stories of resilience, redemption, and hope. Thanks for being part of this incredible journey. Until next time, keep writing your own ending.